when we see an infection, whether we're talking about HIV and AIDS, or we're talking about a little bacteria called bacillus that then can cause tuberculosis, or this COVID situation is a great example of it. When we interact with the microbial world, what we are describing is a terrain or an ecosystem of experience, and it is a vast ecosystem when in a healthy state. And that ecosystem is always adapting and adjusting to stressors. When we see a microbe become endemic in an area, and polio is a great example of this, HIV is a great example of this now, where we have endemic areas where the virus is simply in the environment at such a level that it's very likely that we're going to see manifestations of adaptation of the humans in that environment are going to absorb that microbe. And so some of those people living in endemic polio areas will manifest a disease that we call polio. But many people outside of that small population that are getting sick are being exposed to that polio through their water systems and the like. And so these have been natural elements within it, within the environment. HIV looks to be, extremely underdiagnosed. There's a really interesting study that screened 8,000 healthy people with no history of infectious disease, had screened negative through blood banks and stuff like that, and they did genomic analysis for a couple hundred viruses that are known. And they found 42 viruses in the bloodstream of these patients that were totally healthy and asymptomatic with no history and had screened negative by antibody testing and the like for things like HIV and things like that. And they found an extraordinary amount of HIV and hepatitis C and all these conditions in this asymptomatic population, which suggests that these microbes are part of our normal daily biologic experience. Occasionally, we will find a syndrome of immune deficiency, which is not a human experience. We can go into what is the human immune system in a minute, but what's happening is there's an imbalance that can suddenly happen where all of these microbes, and there's so many in the human body, you're at 30,000 species of bacteria and who knows how many of the 5 million species of fungi and who knows how many of the 300,000 species of parasites. We have done such a poor job of really understanding what the healthy terrain of the human body does. But looking at the hunter-gatherers in Africa right now with the American Gut Project with Jeff Leach, you can see that the American is now walking around with about 10% of the microbiome of the gut that we should have. And so we're 90% deficient. When you become 90% deficient in the ecosystem, you're going to get weeds. And the weeds come in and will overgrow an area, just like they do in your backyard. If you go and rototill your backyard, destroy the balanced ecosystem of a meadow, you're going to immediately get weeds that come in that weren't there, when the biodiversity was there. They weren't evident, but they were there because their seeds were in the environment enough that as soon as there was an opportunity for them to come into their niche, they would do that. But we need to, look to the farmers here who are doing regenerative agriculture to find out that the weeds are never the problem. The weeds are the symptom of the collapse of biodiversity. And I would say that same thing for polio, for HIV, for any of these infections is when the biodiversity is there, we can reach a homeostatic state where the hundreds of thousands of species of grasses and plant life in a jungle maintain an eco-balance, and there's no opportunity for disequilibrium or unbalance or dis-ease in that environment. If you go through and dump a bunch of Agent Orange into that environment, or its close cousin Roundup or glyphosate, and you destroy that jungle, then you're going to see a very unbalanced system and the weeds come up. But the weeds are not the problem. In fact, they are part of the solution, amazingly. And so the weeds, we now find out in regenerative agriculture, is part of nature's way of regenerating the ecosystem. And so the weeds have these important early niches in reforming the networks of mycelium and intelligence within the soil that can then rebuild the microecosystems for the bacteria and fungi, and then ultimately the seedlings and the biodiversity come back up out of the seed bank that's deep in the soils and express itself again. And so when we stop disturbing soil and let it return to its native state, where we stop plowing, we stop spraying, and we let nature do its thing, we can see native grasslands that we thought extinct for 200 years come back in. No seeding necessary. It comes oozing back out of the matrix of the soil is life itself and biodiversity itself. And it relies on the stepwise progression of weeds into biodiversity. When we have an unbalanced microbiome of a human, where we take them out of their native balanced state of hunter-gatherer system, balanced with their ecosystem, an extension of their ecosystem, and we force them into a village where they have water that's contaminated with feces. They can't touch fresh water. We destroy all of the grasses and grassland diversity within their village. They're now walking on dead clay, and they have huts that are trodden down clay. They've lost any touch with that microbiome of the soil. That's the beginning of endemic disease. That's the beginning of where we see these imbalances. And tuberculosis is a phenomenal example of a condition that didn't spring forth until we created the Industrial Revolution. And suddenly in London and New York, we have endemic problems of tuberculosis happening in the cities because we were so divorced from that ecology of balance, that ecology of harmony there. And then you zip forward back to that regenerative farm, and you say, well, okay, so tuberculosis or COVID or any microbe you point out, Lyme being a great example right now, isn't Lyme just the weed. It's just the organism that found its niche in a damaged ecosystem and is on the way back towards. It's doing its role in getting us back to biodiversity. And yet, as physicians, we've been taught to kill it. As farmers, we've been taught to kill it. And so we rush in and kill all the weeds, and then we wonder why the weeds are worse next year and why our crops are doing worse next year, so that we have to put in more nitrogen fertilizers and chemical inputs and all of this. And the plants are weaker, so they're more prone to pests and stuff, so it's more herbicides, more pesticides, and we get into this vicious cycle. And then we wonder why our children have gone from 1.2% of chronic disease to by most recent Medicaid screens, 52% of children with a chronic disorder or disease. 1.2 to 52% since the 1960s. And so what in the last 50 years has it created this epidemic of biologic denuding or biologic loss in our children and in our farmland? And the answer is a war against the microbiome. And so when we see the emergence of something like COVID or something like HIV, we can be confident that the HIV wasn't the problem. It was our lack of intelligence at the soil level of our bodies or in our gardens or in our farm fields. And we have been destroying that microbial diversity that would lead to a balanced ecosystem. And so we call them pathogens. We call them these dangerous germs. But in fact, they've been here since the beginning of time in some shape or form. And this whole concept of militarizing things, all that, humans can't even touch the speed of biodiversity, the biodiversification of the viruses. They are so fast in replication, and they are so fast to shift their genomics. We can't keep up with that. There's no laboratory in the world that can do it as fast as nature does it. Nature is an adaptive, beautiful machine.